Hey folks, just gonna sit here and talk to you about some population stuff today. Talking about ecology, we looked at how organisms interact with one another through food webs and food chains and stuff like that. Today we get to talk about populations. What does that mean? Okay, so populations give us kind of a good insight into how organisms, like large groups, interact with one another. Okay, recall that a population is a group of the same type of organism that lives in the same area that can kind of interbreed and kind of continue their species on. Okay, so we do look at a lot of different characteristics. You can see here density, size, age structure, dispersion, where they live, and that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to be looking at and talking about here today. Um, how do we find the size of a population? There's a number of ways we can do it. We're not going to be able to get to this, but in outdoor adventures, you get to do this mark and recapture method, which is just pretty fun. You get to actually go in and catch little mice, mark them, and then figure out the population from that. But there are a bunch of different ways we can do it, and depending on the species, the organism, you're going to use different methods. Okay, you could count every individual, right? The problem with that is if there are a lot of them, you don't get to the time that it would take. It would be immense. You know, if they move around, it's hard. You can do random sampling if the dispersion, right? If they're like spaced out equally. And then organisms that move, mark and recapture is a big one. Okay, so there are a bunch of different ways you can actually determine the size of a population. From that, right, this is the thing that's very important. From that, we get to kind of learn stuff. Okay, so once we kind of figure out how many are there, we can figure out a few other things. Okay, we can look at then population size. So how do we figure out population size? Obviously, we know birth rate, adds organisms to the environment. Death rate will take them out, and then populations move around. Some populations move. So you get immigration and emigration. So immigration, individual come into the population, emigration, they will move out. So if you look at like birth rate and immigration minus death rate and emigration, will give us then our population size. Again, so what do we learn from all this, right? Kind of the meat here. We can start looking at survivorship. Okay, how long do individuals live? When do they die in their lifespans and stuff like that? So really important here, right? You can look at this one on the left. Look at these graphs, right? We have type 1, 2, and 3. So type 1, 2, and 3 on the bottom in purple, okay? And what are we learning from this, right? So type 1 organisms, like they're born and they survive. And they survive and survive and survive. And then they get old and then they start to die, okay? So you can kind of say large organisms like hippos. And on this graph, you see rhinos. Those are, right? They take care of their young. They're letting their young live for a long time, and then they die when they get to old age. Okay, type 3 is the exact opposite. Here in the purple graph, we have type 3, right? And really early on, a lot of them die. Okay, so they have a lot of babies, right? A lot of those babies die, but if they make it, they're gonna live a long time. Okay, so I like to talk about like trees and seeds. You guys see acorns all the time. Those are the offspring. Those are the babies, right? A lot of them die. They don't become trees. Maple trees with the little helicopter things, right? Those are the same thing, okay? Insects, right? You see this little moth there. Fish do that, right? They have a lot of babies and not a lot of them make it, and so they die, right? They die pretty rapidly, and then they survive if they can make it. Type 2, right? So this blue line, the purple on this other graph, shows us that it's 50-50. You make it, you don't make it. These are a lot of like primary consumers. You see this little gecko, this little lizard there, birds, right? It's like 50-50 they're going to make it, right? And it doesn't matter how old you are, you still have that chance, okay? So these are survivorship curves. They show us like how organisms are kind of surviving throughout their lifespan. Which brings us to reproductive strategies, right? So each of these organisms, right, have different types and ways that they can reproduce and survive. Okay, so our strategy, right, called rate strategists, right, they produce quickly and have a lot of offspring. Think small organisms, right? Organisms that don't spend a lot of time raising their offspring. Okay, what they do is they have these babies and they leave, right? Like spiders, they have a big clutch and they're like, see ya, I'm out, right? So they're generally really small. Not always, again, not always. But then they also don't take any energy raising them, okay? And they don't live very long, a lot of them. Again, this is not like universal either, okay? Like turtles, right? They have a lot of babies and they don't really spend time raising them. They're like, I gotta go because I gotta take care of myself. So things that like get preyed on a lot. will probably be an R strategy. The opposite of that is the K strategy, right? Where they have very few offspring. They have like 1 or 2 offspring, and they spend a lot of time raising them, okay, to like maturity. They live a long time, right? So that they're investing a lot of time because they know the payoff in the end is going to be huge, right? We are K strategists, humans are, right? You can see in these pictures, we got elephants and giraffes, like think like larger organisms that can easily fend off, right? They can easily take care of themselves and fend off like predators. Okay. The different kind of things, right? So we have like type 1 generally tend to be like the K strategist, right? Just kind of looking down here. And then the type 3, where they die early, tend to be the R strategy. Okay. And that brings us to also then growth rate. Look at population growth rate. On the left here, we have exponential growth. And organisms will show exponential growth like early on if they like have ideal conditions. They inhabit a new area, right? They have this exponential growth. Their population starts off real slow and then it shoots up. Okay. That rarely happens though, because there are other factors that tend to come into play when we are looking at organisms and what affects them. Okay. So ideal conditions don't really exist in nature. They do for maybe a little bit, but then stuff happens. Okay. You have predators that come around. You have just the amount of space and habitat, and then food, right? All that stuff is limiting these organisms. And so here on the right, this graph on the right, we actually have what we have a carrying capacity or logistical gray throat. Okay. And we see that exponential there, but then it levels off, right? And it levels off at what we call carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that can be in an environment, okay, based on food and predators and stuff like that, okay? We usually measure it in winter because that's like the hardship, right? And so the amount of food there is less and animals will die. And so we measure in winter. We can see like it goes up and down above and below carrying capacity based on kind of how much resources there are available. And so kind of, again, a couple key things is exponential growth rarely happens. Usually what we get is logistical growth that levels off then at our carrying capacity. Okay. A couple other things about just populations. We have their density, right? Where are they, right? How are they dispersed, right? You can see 3 different ways organisms are dispersed. We have like clumped, right? These organisms that clump together, and they might clump together because there's protection, right? Might clump together because that's where their resources are. So like fish do that. Here we have just random, right? So seeds get dispersed, they randomly fall, and that's where they grow. And then we have like uniform. These are like territorial organisms, right? The penguins I love because they each have their little nest and they defend it, right? Or bears or something like that will have this very like uniform. They like, I cover this area, you stay over there. Okay. Here are just some other pictures of kind of that as well. But what limits population, right? We obviously don't have an infinite amount of organisms out there, okay? So there are limiting factors when we talk about populations, okay? Some of those are tolerance, right? So here is a great example, right? Trout don't grow everywhere, right? They don't live everywhere, I should say. So this diagram shows us, right? We have this optimum zone of where trout can live. This applies to all organisms, right? There's this optimal zone that organisms live. Anywhere outside of that zone, so left and right, of the optimal zone, we see the numbers decline. Okay, they're stressed out. That's not like the ideal conditions for them. Okay, and then eventually there's like zone of intolerance here where you just don't have creatures. Okay, they don't exist there. And so we're looking at this and we can see like organisms are limited where they are. Think about like a tree. Trees don't grow in the desert. There's no water, right? So that'd be like a zone of intolerance. That exists for all organisms. Obviously, there's an optimal zone. Okay. Some other factors that can affect organisms and where they are and how their numbers are called density independent factors. And density independent factors are going to affect populations regardless of how many are in the population. A forest fire is going to affect a population whether there's 5 in that population or 1,000 in that population. Okay. Usually these are abiotic factors. Okay. So there's that word again, abiotic, non-living things. Right. So if you think about it, fire, not living, affects populations, regardless of how many are there. Okay. Contrast it with density dependent factors, right? Factors that affect organisms based on the size of the population. Okay. So predators are going to affect the prey population when there are more prey, right? Predators can exist more when there are more organisms for there to eat. Okay, diseases are the same, right? Like diseases spread faster when there are more organisms living together. Okay, competition increases when there are more organisms, right? You don't have those things, right, when there are less organisms, right? So that's a density dependent. Think of it like it depends on the amount in the population. Okay, so those are some things. Usually these are biotic factors, not always, but again, generally speaking, these are biotic factors. So density dependent. Shift gears here real quick. Let's talk about human population. Right. So we talk about just animals. Humans are different beasts, right? I mentioned them in my class a couple times, but they're a bit different. Our human population growth, you can see, is growing at an exponential rate. It's crazy. Okay. Less developed countries are putting more than more developed countries, right, for various reasons. But why is this? Why can we grow exponentially? Why we don't have a limit? Okay, and there's a lot of different reasons. I know you guys have looked at this in the past, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. But basically, the big stuff is that we have the technology, whether that be through medicine, sanitation, and better food, to kind of push the boundaries of human population, right? And we're going to talk about this next week about human impact, right? Because we're growing so much, we are impacting our ecosystems locally and then like globally in certain ways. We're going to look at that, right? So kind of just keeping in mind that. Here are some age structure diagrams, which again, I know you guys have talked about in other classes, but we can see like we have these rapid growth countries, right? So some countries are growing rapidly where the bottom, the base of the pyramid is super wide, okay? And the top is really skinny. Then we have these other countries who are like slow growth, right? Where we're not contributing a lot, right? Because enough are dying off that they kind of just replace a one-to-one thing, all right? And we have what we have over on the left here. It says rapid growth is usually, again, it's like areas that have they don't have the medicine necessarily, or they're just getting the medicine and they don't realize it, or they're farming communities, or they're low income countries and stuff like that. And so these age structure diagrams can really give us an insight into the world that we are living in. Here are some more, right? So some have a growing, some have a declining, right? And why is that? To parse education and medicine and the access to that stuff, okay? And the big key here is that we're going to look at human impact, okay? And it brings in this, like, what is our carrying capacity? What is the impact that we are having on the world? Thinking about, are humans impacting the world? How are we impacting the world? What is our carrying capacity? Are we there? Are we close? Can we triple our population? We're at 7.5 whatever billion people right now. Can we go higher? Should we go higher? All right. That's just kind of one thing we're going to discuss kind of throughout the next week or two is that. So that wraps up human populations. Hopefully it works. You guys